Imagine this. You have just performed the most miraculous feat in all of human history. You have conquered death. You have come back to life. If your goal is to convince the world that you are the Son of God, wouldn't you, show up in the temple courts? Or knock on Pontius Pilate's door? Maybe even pay a visit to the Pharisees? But according to the Bible, Jesus didn't do any of those things. Instead, he only appeared to a select group of people, his own followers. For 40 days after his resurrection, he showed himself to his disciples, sometimes even in public places like the road to Emmaus or a mountaintop in Galilee. Paul even mentions that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at once. But here's the thing. There's not a single recorded appearance to any outsider. No skeptics, no Roman officials, no priests. Why? Let's talk about it. Hello my friends, this is Shane at Mindful Living. On this channel, we explore faith through reason, critical thinking, and introspection. Even if you are a Christian with firm belief, it's valuable to reflect thoughtfully on why you believe what you do. Doing so can help make your faith stronger and more coherent. So, let's dive in. According to Christian tradition, Jesus appeared to his followers multiple times after the resurrection. Some of these appearances were supposedly in public or semi-public spaces. But despite that, there are no accounts from neutral observers or critics who saw Jesus alive after his death and before his supposed ascension. It's almost like Jesus was going out of his way to keep his resurrection private, like an exclusive event only for insiders, which raises a serious question. If Jesus really wanted the world to believe in him, as shown in the Great Commission, where he tells his followers to go make disciples of all nations, then why not help them out by showing himself to at least a few non-believers? Why not appear to a Pharisee, a Roman centurion, or even someone mildly skeptical? Some Christians respond by saying that Jesus didn't appear to everyone because he respects human free will. If he showed himself to people, they say it would override their freedom to choose and force them to believe. But this explanation doesn't hold up. Jesus did appear to his disciples, so are we saying he didn't respect their free will? If seeing the reason Jesus compromises a person's ability to choose, then the disciples had their free will violated. And if God could do that with them, why not with others? More importantly, wouldn't it actually help God's purpose if more people had access to this kind of evidence? If Christianity is about leading people to repent and believe, wouldn't a personal appearance from Jesus be the most effective way to do that? Speaking personally, if I had to choose between God respecting my free will by staying hidden, or appearing to me so I could truly believe and be saved, then yes, I'd rather he showed up. Condemning people for not believing while withholding the very proof that convinced others just seems unfair. It doesn't look like God is protecting people's free will. It looks more like certain people were given privileged access, while the rest of us are left to figure things out from ancient testimonies and second-handed stories. And here's another problem. The Bible itself doesn't treat miracles as threats to free will. In the Old Testament, the Israelites witnessed miracle after miracle in the wilderness, yet Joshua still tells them to choose to follow God. Clearly, seeing wonders didn't eliminate their ability to choose. In fact, the entire Old Testament is filled with stories of people turning away from God after witnessing divine acts. Even Jesus points this out in his parable of Lazarus. When a rich man begs Abraham to send Lazarus back from the dead to warm his family, Abraham replies that if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. That only makes sense if people can still reject God even after seeing a miracle. So not only is the free will argument logically flawed, it's also inconsistent with the Bible itself. The parable of Lazarus highlights another crucial issue beyond just the free will argument, the idea of hardened hearts. Some Christians say Jesus don't appear to more people because those determined not to believe would reject him anyway. Their hearts were closed, so even a direct appearance from Jesus wouldn't have mattered. People with open hearts would believe through the testimony of the disciples alone. At first glance, that might sound reasonable until we look at the disciples themselves. When the woman rushed back from the tomb, claiming to have seen the risen Jesus, none of the male disciples believed them, not one. Even after two other men, likely the ones on the road to Emmaus, came back with the same report, the rest of the group still refused to believe. Mark explicitly says they did not believe them either. So were the disciples' hearts hardened? Clearly not, because once Jesus appeared to them personally, they changed their minds. This shows something crucial. Skepticism toward eyewitness testimony doesn't automatically indicate a closed heart. Sometimes people simply need better evidence. Ironically, the disciples' experience contradicts the Lazarus parable. Jesus knew they initially rejected eyewitness accounts, yet still chose to appear to them. Not once, but multiple times. He could have said, "They didn't believe the woman? Their loss." That would have matched the logic of the parable. But he didn't. He gave them the proof they needed. And even then, according to Matthew, some disciples still doubted. Imagine that Jesus is standing right there, visible and tangible, yet some hesitated. The disciples weren't special believers with extraordinary faith. They were ordinary people wrestling with an extraordinary event, just as most of us would. I'm sure there were others at the time who were equally thoughtful, cautious, yet open to belief. But curiously, Jesus only appeared to his inner circle. Speaking for myself, I can tell you I am not resistant to belief. I used to be a Christian for over 20 years. I want to find good reasons to believe. I don't want those years to feel wasted. If convincing evidence of the resurrection were available, I would be more than happy to become a Christian again. You can't simply say that people like me have hardened hearts, as if we reject the truth no matter what. That's just not true. And it's not just me. There are many non-resistant non-believers, people who have spent years honestly searching, reflecting, and hoping to find evidence that would lead them to believe. And yet, for many of us, the evidence just hasn't been sufficient. If the resurrection is supposed to be the foundation of the Christian faith, then wouldn't it make sense for Jesus to appear at least once to someone outside the inner circle? A skeptic, a Roman official, a Pharisee, even just one. Yet, according to biblical accounts, virtually every appearance was to people who already followed Jesus. No skeptic or critic was given that chance prior to the ascension. And we are expected to believe this story, a story that even his closest followers didn't accept until he appeared to them in person. They needed more than testimony, they needed proof. But today we are told that if we don't believe based on their testimonies alone, we are guilty of rejecting God and thus stand condemned. As John 3:18 says, "Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son." Now, some Christians argue that Jesus' brother James is proof that skeptics can and did come to believe because of the resurrection. The claim goes like this: James didn't believe in Jesus during his ministry, but after seeing the risen Christ, he was so convinced that he became a key leader in the early church. Let's take a closer look. Yes, John 7:5 tells us that even his own brothers did not believe in him. That suggests James and his siblings were skeptical of Jesus during his public ministry. And in Mark 3:21, there's a scene where Jesus' family thinks he's out of his mind. This is often used to show that James too doubted or even disapproved of Jesus at the time. But here's what we don't know, and this is important. We don't know when James came to believe. The Gospel of John gives us a snapshot of skepticism during Jesus' ministry, but that doesn't mean James remained a skeptic all the way to Jesus' death. A lot can change over time. James could have been skeptical early on, but slowly became more sympathetic or convinced as he watched his brother teach, heal, and confront religious leaders. In other words, there's no clear record showing that James was still in disbelief by the time of the crucifixion. So the entire apologetic argument that the resurrection alone flipped James from skeptic to believer is built on a big assumption. It assumes James was hostile to Jesus at the time of his death, and that it took a resurrection appearance to change his mind. But we don't know that. It's possible James had already changed his view of Jesus before the resurrection, or at least softened his stance. Not only that, we don't know what kind of appearance Paul is referring to when he says in 1 Corinthians 15:7, "Then he appeared to James." Paul uses the same language to describe his own vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus, which was not a physical, bodily appearance, but more of a spiritual encounter. So if James had a similar experience, it wouldn't be all that different from religious visions in other religious traditions. And finally, we don't have any record of James telling his own story. No writings from him describe a journey from skepticism to faith. We are not hearing from James himself. We are piecing together a narrative from scattered verses and a lot of assumptions. So while it's possible that James started out skeptical and changed his mind after seeing the risen Jesus, the case is far from clear. If this is supposed to be a strong example of a non-believer being convinced by the resurrection, it's built on a very shaky ground. Now, let's say for the sake of argument that the Christian interpretation is correct, that James was a hardened skeptic who only came to believe because he saw the risen Jesus. If that's the case, then it actually undermines the two common Christian defenses we discussed earlier. First, you can't argue God respects skeptics' free will too much to show them miracles, because apparently God didn't respect James's skepticism. Second, you can't say that a miraculous appearance wouldn't change a skeptic's mind anyway, because again, in James's case, it supposedly did. So if James is your example of a skeptic transformed by the resurrection, you can't also claim that Jesus had to limit his appearances to protect people's free will, or that miracles were ineffective for hardened hearts. You can't have it both ways. By now, I hope it's clear the resurrection appearances don't align with the idea that Jesus wanted everyone to believe. Why limit undeniable proof to a handful of insiders while expecting the rest of us to rely solely on second-handed stories? If Jesus wanted the world to believe, he had every chance to make that happen, but he didn't. What if the reason that Jesus didn't appear to outsiders is that he didn't appear to anyone at all? At least not in a way Christians commonly imagine. Or maybe the reason Jesus didn't appear to the world is because he never rose from the dead. Maybe the resurrection story began within a small group of followers, grew over time, and spread to places where the details couldn't be easily verified. That would explain the selective nature of the appearances. It would explain why the movement faced resistance in Jerusalem and Judea, where people may have tried to fact-check and found the claims unconvincing. And it would explain why Christianity took off in the diaspora and among Gentiles, people who couldn't investigate the events for themselves and had to rely solely on personal testimony. In that light, the resurrection wasn't hidden for theological reasons. It was just a story that developed quietly within a close-knit group before spreading outward to those less able to question it. How could such a story develop without a historical resurrection? I discussed this in detail in another video, exploring potential connections to Greco-Roman culture and mythology. If you are curious, I encourage you to check it out. So what do you think? If Jesus really rose from the dead, why didn't he appear to everyone? Let me know your thoughts below. If you find this video interesting or thought-provoking, please drop a like and subscribe. Other than that, see you in the next one.